Hello, students of church history class, and welcome to the first online lecture. And this will be on the Renaissance. And I have your notes up on my screen. I'd encourage you to perhaps watch this video on your phone and be able to take your notes yourself, or print out your study guide and complete it as we go along. Let's begin by talking about some basics of the Renaissance. The first thing I'm going to talk about is what the word Renaissance means, and the word means rebirth. And it particularly has to do with the rebirth of Greco-Roman culture. What is Greco-Roman culture? It means the culture back before Christianity took over with Constantine, when you had the Greek mythology and the Greek with the different Greek and Roman gods, when you had those nude sculptures, when you had different plays being written, different legal codes being written, not based on the Bible, but based on common sense of morality and philosophy. And all these things were coming back into Europe during the 1400s, 1500s, and at least the early 1600s. The Renaissance began in Italy, and again took place during the 15th through the 16th and a little bit of the 17th centuries. The dates are up here on the notes as well. And why? What was the causes of this? Well, it has to do with what we left off with right before you all went on your pseudo missions trip. First of all, it had to do with new information, new sources, and people coming into Italy because of the fall of Constantinople and the Byzantine Empire. If you look at your map, if you look at where Greece is and where Turkey is today, notice just to the west of Greece and not too far from Constantinople is Italy. And these northern Italian city-states became the hot spots of the Renaissance. And so as the Byzantine Empire came to an end due to the Ottoman Turks, people wanted to protect the Christian writings. People wanted to protect the ancient arts. People wanted to protect what they could from falling into what the people they viewed as infidels. And so in 1453, as Constantinople was falling in the years and before that, the decades before that, many artifacts, many manuscripts, and scholars fled to Western Europe for safety. And so you can imagine all of a sudden these universities that had been budding in medieval Europe getting their hands on statues, on copies of the Bible and Greek philosophy, and meeting people who exposed them to all these things that they had not taken into account in their studies and in their writing. And so it caused this idea, this motto that became important in the Renaissance, particularly in a branch of education called humanism, to go back to the sources and see what people had thought of before the medieval time, those dark ages, those times where the church was just trying to survive and to spread. But before that, when culture was blossoming, what was going on? Also, during this time period, there was many wealthy people in the middle class, and we talked about that was a key factor in the rise of universities, and these northern city-states in Italy also had a great middle class that could afford to pay for art and pay for studies, and so ideas emerged that were not that could not be shut down as easily by the church or by rulers. So let's look at some specific examples now of how the Renaissance affected society and life. Please note that this was not an overnight change. It wasn't like one day people were thinking one way and the next they were thinking another way, but rather these changes happen over decades, even over centuries. But if you look at what life was like in 1400 compared to what life was like in 1600, there was definitely some notable changes that really affect everything. And so what we want to do in the rest of this video is to explore these changes. And we'll be looking at 3 different topics. We'll be looking at how books and reading changed things, how studies changed things. 4 different topics, or 3 different topics, and how life changed. Let's start off with books and reading. It's a common expression, readers are leaders, and so the rise of these new books coming in from the Byzantine Empire that was falling, and meeting up with the universities that were blossoming throughout Europe caused a lot of changes. In the Middle Ages, books were only for the super wealthy. It's estimated a book the size of the Bible, for instance, would cost an equivalent of maybe $10,000 today, maybe $12,000. So you're talking that very few people could afford books unless you were nobility, unless you were a university, unless you were a prominent church, you would not own a book. But in 1453, the same year that Constantinople fell, a German named Johannes Gutenberg invented the printing press. Think of it as the first Xerox machine. And in fact, more books were made with this device between 1450 and 1500 than had been made in the previous 1,000 years. So that was revolutionary. You're talking about more books in 50 years than 1,000 years. So here is an example of what the printing press would look like. Or not. Here's one right here. You can see that basically you could put paper underneath or whatever you're printing on, and then kind of stamp down the images and text after you cut that out. So it would take time to engrave the initial copy that would be used to make that would be used to reproduce in mass quantity, but once that was done, you could just stamp, and make as many pages as you had ink and paper. So you can imagine that before, unless you were supported by the super rich, you wouldn't necessarily have a desire to read because you probably wouldn't be able to get your hands on books. But now more and more people wanted to read because books were more or less available to all. Even if you couldn't afford a big book like the Bible, perhaps you could at least have a pamphlet or a paper or something that you could read. And so this had great effects on society in general, as we talk about how many people were literate and the percentages, all that began to increase in Europe. And as it began to increase, if you remember in the Middle Ages, almost everything was in Latin. If you went to the university, no matter if you spoke French, Spanish, English, German, you were going to learn the Latin. But by the Renaissance, because books were becoming prominent, people wanted them. Latin was still used in the universities as the lingua franca. But more and more books were in the vernacular, the language that people spoke day to day. So that had a huge effect. With reading comes knowledge, comes questioning, comes awareness, and this was affecting many social classes, but particularly those who are able to study at universities. And so let's look now at the impact it had on universities. First, if you remember from the medieval period, learning was, that was a mistake. Learning was primarily a spiritual and philosophical task. Or we could say religious and philosophical. We talked about how everything was meant to teach us about God. And if you looked at medieval books and writings, treatises on music or on colors or on sciences, everything was meant to connect us to God who made the world and to Christ who redeemed the world. There was always spiritual symbolism in the sounds that were made in different harmonies, in the colors and the numbers, in hand gestures. Everything had a symbol and was meant to teach us about God. But the Renaissance began a more secular approach. Not that, again, this was an overnight and one day people were talking about God and the next day they were questioning whether God existed. Definitely not any of that. In fact, as far as I know, pretty much everybody in the Renaissance would still identify as a Christian. They were not questioning God's existence, but they began, when I say secular, to see art, literature, and science focused on the created world and humans for what it was without spiritualizing it. In other words, you can study ants because they're interesting, not because they teach us to be working hard in our service to God. You can study music because it's beautiful without having to say what this chord represents theologically or that chord represents theologically. And I think the easiest way to see this is in art. So let's take a moment and look at some examples of art, and I'll show you what I mean. We're going to begin with an image, a medieval image of Christ's burial. And so if we look here, you see in many ways a simple picture, but there's lots going on symbolically. The colors mean things, the shape outlining, the place is pointing upward to the heavens. You see the halo around Christ and his wounds and the hands in prayer. You see the John with the gospel he writes, and the picture, although flat and non-realistic, has rich meaning in terms of what it communicates. Notice the cross in the upper left-hand corner even. Let's look at now a picture that was later on in the medieval period, some call it the Proto-Renaissance. Here you have a more dramatic picture, but again, there's lots of symbolism. You have the halos representing the different saints in the burial of Christ. You have the modesty protecting his loins by the woman in the green, and different hand gestures, objects being carried, cloaks and whatnot. They represent things. And so and even the angels, there are 10 of them. I'm not quite sure if that has a specific meaning, but I imagine it may very well do so. Things begin to change drastically when you get to the Renaissance. Look at this picture of a late Renaissance work by Caravaggio. Notice that there are no halos. Notice that it is dark and sad. Notice you see the side butt of Christ as a man, just like every other man who's buried. There is no special distinguishing features of him. He is dead and the people are sad. There is no major representations. There's a little kind of lily and down underneath where they're about to bury him. But things are much more just on the sadness, sorrow, and what it's like to bury a dead person who is loved. And if we go to another Renaissance work, I find this one even more stark in what it communicates. Here you have Christ laid and helpless. You have some people mourning on the side and are very distraught and sorrowful. But again, here is Christ. Notice how much more realistic these images look than the medieval time. There's a small halo around his head, but other than that, he looks just like a person who is dead. And notice, too, just the angles are just much more intimate. If you go back to the Renaissance art, you have a non-detailed dead Christ whose clothes were stripped from him before crucifixion. Again, very plain bodily outlines, versus in the Renaissance art, it's much more realistic, much more dramatic. You have muscle tones, and the flesh wounds are much more obvious and perhaps even grotesque. And there Christ lays there, dead. So you can see here that the art takes a much more realistic approach, not trying to communicate some symbolism, but just reflect on the humanness of mourning, the humanness of death. And this continues in other forms of art too. Some related to the Bible and others not. So here's the famous statue of David, and you notice he is naked, like a Greek and Roman style. He has a sling above his shoulders, and he's confident and strong. Notice there's no harp, there's no head of Goliath, there's no symbolism in the crown. He is just a strong youth, ready for the world. Some paintings and statues also took on Greek images of Greek philosophy. So here is the god of wine, Bacchus. And again, notice the almost nudity in this image. Notice, again, the fact that they were painting somebody who had been worshipped. That wasn't done in the Middle Ages because they were trying to get rid of paganism and polytheism and all that they had viewed as heresy, if you remember the Inquisition and other things. But here, again, you have this very lush nature scene. Notice the animals in the background, and there's, again, no symbolism about the colors or numbers or shapes. The hand gestures, I think, are pointing for specific reasons, but again, it's much less symbolic, much more just real, and much more just about the flesh of the person depicted. Notice just even the poses with the legs crossed and the face. It's just meant to be more approaching more realism. The art and architecture also changed, not as much in terms of the realism, but there was just greater grandeur as technology began to improve, mathematics began to improve. It'll be in the late Renaissance that you have the birth of calculus and other mathematical forms, geometry, that allow for our modern day world. And so here is St. Peter's Basilica in the Vatican, where the Pope resides and presides, and you can just see the hugeness of the church. And it's hard to tell in this image, but there are lots of statues above and different images, and the people are tiny and the building is big. Here's an image inside St. Peter's Basilica. Notice again the marble, the gold, the intricacies. This was built by Raphael and designed by Raphael, and the art done by him. And again, it is very immense, and as we'll talk about, very costly. And so what happened as the church began to support all these arts? How did that affect its ministry? How did it affect its situation in the culture? Again, notice the tiniest of the people and the grandeur of everything else. There's the altar where the Pope presides over for communion. Here is a website with a virtual tour of the Sistine Chapel. I encourage you to look it up if you'd like to. It's really something. This perhaps is, in my opinion, the greatest feat of Renaissance art and architecture. Again, this is a chapel. It's not, although it's used as an art museum today, it is a chapel. There's an organ to your right, and there is an altar front and center here. So imagine this is your own private place to worship. Think about the fact that we worship in our school's cafeteria, multi-purpose room, and imagine having the money that you could build a building maybe the size of Cedar Hall and have it lavishly decorated just for your own private worship services. It's a chapel, not a church, so it's just for the Pope and his inner circle. And so as you walk in this tour, you're just surrounded by art related to so many things in the Bible. There's there's art above you. Here is the very famous picture of creation and the fall, where God and man are separated. If you notice, almost dead center toward the top. But that's just one of countless images. I can't imagine how he designed all this and was able to fit it just perfectly. I can barely fit my words on a line when I plan to write a sentence. But if you notice, all around you, side walls, front walls, the curves into the ceiling, the back, there are just countless images of the Bible. And again, notice that Renaissance marks of the nudity, the realism, the drama, and it's definitely a focus on what it's like to be human, the humanness of the stories in the Bible, not as much some symbolism that overshadows that. This one wall above the altar is the Last Judgment, and so you see Christ here casting out those who will spend eternity in hell and welcoming those who are saved. And again, lots of nudity or little clothes, lots of muscle tones and dramatic poses. And it's an intense scene right above the altar to connect us to the idea that it is through Christ that we are able to have the hope of ascending to eternal life with God in heaven. So again, this is a private chapel of the Pope. Today it's mostly used as a museum of art, but when it was made as a gift to the Pope so that he could worship there with those he would like to worship with. So, very different cultures. Now, as we talk about studies, then we can see not just that it was a change in focus, but even in method. In the medieval period, learning was primarily by rote, meaning that you would have to memorize everything. Why would you have to memorize everything? Because you couldn't afford textbooks. There were no textbooks. You had to just share things in the library as a common resource. But now, since there were books, you didn't have to memorize everything. You could reference it and people could look it up. And so instead you could look more at analysis. You could focus your time and energy on different questions and ways of reading the text. Again, the only texts available in the medieval period were those preserved by the monks. But in the Renaissance era, as Constantinople fell, tons of new books, they weren't really new, they were just new to the Westerners, came into Western Europe, and this caused a revival of using Greek texts, including the New Testament. So you can imagine getting copies of the Bible, these ancient manuscripts in Greek, and how much more you'd have to study now that things were in its original language. People again comparing these older original Greek texts, not the original like the first copies of them, but these older copies in the original language to the Latin translations they had been using, and they realized that there were lots of discrepancies as the monks and others had made mistakes in copying the text. And this led to what's called textual criticism, if you remember this from freshman and sophomore Bible, the task of going through the manuscripts to try to find what were the original words in the Bible or other ancient books. And again, a common motto was to go back to the sources. Don't just settle for what had become common in Western Europe. Go back to the originals and read the Bible in Hebrew and Greek. Read Aristotle and Plato in Greek. Look at the ancient forms of art, the Greek plays and other ancient Greco-Roman artifacts and literary sources. I'm going to stop the video here, and I'll add a brief second video because I don't want to run out of time.